Welcome, everyone, to the 11th episode of Thinking Out Loud. Today we're joined by Shapiro, the filmmaker, writer, and podcaster. We have a long-ranging discussion involving ethics amidst the coronavirus and good tribalism versus bad tribalism. You'll notice his mic is the only one that sounds great. That's because he's the only one with the decency to record with a good mic. Anyways, as always, hope you enjoy this podcast. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to episode 11 of Thinking Out Loud. I am your host, Vincent Freeman, as always, and I'm joined together with my friend, Bruce. Bruce, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks once again for having us, Vince.
Yeah. And I have a very special guest today. He's the director of Islam and the Future of Tolerance. He's a writer and podcaster. He's host of the Dilemma podcast alongside Coleman Hughes. Everyone, please give a resounding welcome to Jay Shapiro.
Thanks for having me, guys.
Yeah, it's an honor to have you on the podcast. Now, we have you at unfortunately, not the best of times. We're all in quarantine here, so the coronavirus is certainly going to be a topic of conversation, especially since you published a tremendous article on it, one that delves pretty deeply into moral philosophy. And I think that's one of the great things about your podcast. One of the things I admire most about it is that it really gets into the weeds of moral philosophy, and that's one of the topics that I find more interesting. So, if you don't mind, we're going to go ahead and give a little brief discussion about your article, Live Free and Kill Grandma. Interesting title.
Yes. Tell me where we should start with it.
You begin your article with a quote from the jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes that sort of gives a bit of a libertarian mantra. The liberty to swing your fist ends where my nose begins. And it seems like originally a clear-cut descriptor of morality, but as you brought up in your article, we're encountering instances where the truth may be more complicated. Would you mind elaborating on that a bit?
Yeah, sure. I mean, it's So I start with this sort of creed of what could be called sort of a libertarian philosophy of the exact quote is what your liberty to swing your fist ends where my nose begins. Which makes a lot of sense. And like we do in philosophy, we start obsessing over exactly what that means and digging into where that breaks down. And I think the notion there, which really is pretty self-explanatory, it's a nice analogy of like, you can do what you want, you could be as crazy as you want, but as soon as it harms me, now your liberty ends there, and we have to talk about the problem. So, I point out how this is the foundation for probably a lot of good deciphering of what should be public policy or sort of governmental policy versus just opinion. I cite someone saying something like, I don't like gay marriage, but you can do whatever the hell you want. Consenting adults can do what you want. If you're not hurting anybody else, I don't care what you do. So that's sort of what that grounding gets you. But why I wrote the article, and clearly I think being exposed and exploited by this pandemic that we're all dealing with, is it breaks down, I think, pretty early on when you start thinking about exactly what swinging a fist and hitting a nose means. In the analogy itself, it makes perfect sense because we all know what a physical fight looks like. Someone swings their fist, they hit the nose, there you go. Like, blame is very easy to assign there. But I point out the problem of something like a pandemic is this notion of invisible responsibility, and there's a lot of analogies to these kind of these problems now that in philosophy we could call something like a problem of the commons, where your actions you might not physically see, and I can't even physically see you hitting somebody's nose, but you swinging your fist right now might hit someone's nose indirectly in a way that we can prove just through following a few steps. Something like the virus. So I imagine a way to sort of really grok this idea. This is what a lot of times in moral philosophy, I find it to be a very creative field. We come up with these thought experiments that illuminate exactly what you're trying to say. So to think of how this wouldn't be the case, I imagine this world where there was some crazy color-coded system where we had incredibly good eyesight and we could actually see viruses. So if you could actually see right now, if I hold my hand up and you see the coronavirus on my hand, you had that good eyesight, let's say evolution just geared us that way, that would change the entire dynamic of then me suddenly shaking hands with somebody, and then you see my virus transfer onto their hand, and then they touch their face. Suddenly there's a kind of swinging a fist and hitting a nose analogy there. as I point out, what's interesting is that viruses are not actually invisible. I'm not actually doing anything different there, other than saying we imagine we had better eyesight. I'm not adding anything to that universe, other than this notion of good eyesight. If you have a microscope, you could see the viruses on my hand, and you could sort of trace this moral responsibility, as it were, if I smeared my hands all over someone's, drink or something, then they picked it up and they got coronavirus, there would be a clear kind of moral violation. But because it's invisible to us with our normal evolved eyes, I think it presents a huge challenge to sort of the intuition that Wendell Holmes had with this nose fist sort of grounding, where we have to rethink a lot of these things. I think it's still a good policy to keep in mind. I give libertarians a hard time a lot, but I do find it to be a very moral kind of structure to aim for, but I constantly point out its flaws, because I think we need to be honest about those flaws, and we're seeing a ton of them. Something like this pandemic, going out right now, and we were just talking to a friend of ours someone threw a birthday party, which feels like in normal times the most like innocent thing you could do, of like, cool, a birthday party, but right now feels like, you monster, like how could you do that, like you're going to kill my grandma, which is something that we should celebrate in some ways, because the knowledge that birthday party that someone's throwing somewhere actually puts not just themselves at risk, but a lot of other people indirectly, is a challenge. It's great that we have that knowledge as a species now, that we can make these associations and try to then mitigate these harms. But I think the intuition of do what you want as long as it doesn't hurt anybody is just really under strain and under pressure. And like most of my articles that sort of attack libertarianism, I don't have a clear-cut answer of how we get out of this. Like, I'd really like to avoid what's the alternative socialism kind of conversation. I think that's a boring conversation, and it's not the right alternative. But we have to be honest about what philosophers and what the philosophy of libertarianism looks like in a world where fists and noses are, as I point out, my nose might be closer than it appears when you swing your fist at the moment. So that was sort of a lot to throw out there. It's all in the article, but it's an obvious problem in sort of the libertarian foundations to me that we're all, I think, seeing right now.
Yeah, and one of the really one of the most noteworthy things that you brought up in that article, among many others, was the color coding system that you just mentioned right now,
Right.
where we could just, as you said, if someone had the virus and transmitted it to somebody else, and they exhibited a particular color pattern, you could be able to trace back to where that person originally got the virus, where he originally got the virus from. And so it adds this whole new layer of moral responsibility that we otherwise wouldn't have seen. And we know, for instance, that most of the transmissions that occur with the coronavirus is through asymptomatic people that don't exhibit any symptoms. And so not only is it even more, it's difficult enough for if you're exhibiting symptoms, you don't know whether or not you have the flu or whether or not you have the coronavirus. So it's difficult enough to be able to determine whether or not you should go out there. I mean, you shouldn't, but but it's even more difficult now that we have our moral responsibility completely hidden from us through asymptomatic people. So not only would you castigate people that are leaving their houses who have flu-like symptoms, but you also have to chastise people that are leaving the house in general, because we know that you have no idea if you're even carrying the virus. It's right, even with young people. So it's a good, so that's one of the reasons why we closed down schools, because even though it's very unlikely that someone under the age of 30 is going to be hit severely hard with the virus, or especially even kids who are in high school or in elementary school, we know that they can still carry the virus, and they can transmit it to people who are elderly, who are more susceptible to the virus.
Right.
So my question to you from here would be that I've always thought of two different sets of normative thought, right? So I've always thought between moral expectations versus moral responsibility. A moral expectation would be something along the lines of saying bless you, or saying thank you after someone says bless you, or opening the door, basic courtesy level stuff. Whereas a moral responsibility would be something much more severe, much more along the lines of if you're walking down the street and there's a pond on the right side of you and a child is drowning, people would feel a sort of responsibility to save that child. So there's a difference here in normative thought between moral expectation and moral responsibility. would you consider social isolation, social distancing, all that sort of stuff to be more on the side of moral responsibility or a moral expectation?
Oh gosh, I mean those are tricky questions. I mean the language around the word you put after moral in these conversations is so difficult and precise. Some people say moral obligation or moral requirement or moral expectation, as you're saying, or just just like a moral thing to do. I don't know. So I mean, obsessing over, I'm going to bring in some Karl Popper stuff here, because like obsessing over, he warns philosophers, and he thinks philosophy, he calls it ruinous to philosophy to actually obsess over the definitions of words. And to his dismay, and I think he's right, a lot of people seem to have ignored that fact, and we spend a lot of time in philosophy obsessing over the meanings of words, and he finds it to be a mistake. And I think in this case, I don't know what a moral requirement really is. I could just tell you sort of how I would approach that kind of question. I'll give another anecdote. I asked some of these questions. We never put any of the footage out, to Neil deGrasse Tyson, who famously is a little like not that warm to philosophy. I think he's changed his mind a little bit on it, and he refused to even use the word moral requirement when I offered it to him. And he really stuck to this, like, listen, I could just tell you what I would do, and I won't tell other people what to do. I can't sort of tell people what to do. I could just give them good advice. The challenge here with a requirement is, and it'll relate to my other point, is that I think, I'll just tell you sort of my opinion. I think if the harm that you are inflicting on someone is direct and obvious and physical, like slavery, like is there a moral requirement to not enslave another human physically by, chaining them and making them till your fields? I think the answer is yes, and it's probably yes, that there's a moral requirement not to do that, and you would have to ground that in some sort of, you could bring in Kantianism, you could bring in all sorts of frameworks to say, like, well, this person probably has a conscious experience because they're built of the same kind of stuff I am, and I value my conscious experience, and I wouldn't want them to do that to me, so therefore this is some sort of moral wrong. You could get there a lot of ways, and then you could say you're morally required to not do that. But in this situation, and I bring her into the article as well, I bring Lisa Tessman in, who we had in one of our episodes, who describes, so let me back up even a little more. It's sort of mainstream moral philosophy at the moment now to actually reject the notion of dilemmas even existing in the first place. Meaning that if you find yourself in a situation where there's two possibilities, and by choosing one, it negates the ability to do the other, like a Sophie's Choice type thing, save one child versus the other, or I was trying to, lay it out on a grand scale of save the economy or kill grandma, whatever we're going to do here, social isolate or just go about business as normal. You choose one means you can't do the other. Lisa Tessman makes an argument that, so in mainstream moral philosophy at the moment, they say, well, if you could just calculate, or if you could just know which of the two options was better than the other, maybe by some utilitarian criticism of saying which one leads to more harm, more flourishing and less suffering, however you measure those things. Once you have a framework to just decide which option is better, A or B, well, then you've actually answered the dilemma. And if you then choose A, you cannot choose B. And if you chose the right thing, you've negated the dilemma. And there is no dilemma. So it's just a moral conflict where you do not know the answer. That's actually sort of mainstream philosophy right now. Another really simple way to remember it is ought implies can. So if you ought to do A, then it means you can do A. And that means if I choose A, meaning I can't choose B, I maybe ought to do B, but I can't do B, so it just crosses itself out. So ought implies can is a way to say, like, you're actually never in a dilemma. You have to do what you can do, and then everything else just is crossed out. She rejects it, and I tend to like her rejection psychologically. This is a very long way to say that I'm not going to answer your question, because I like her answer psychologically, by pointing out, in the way she puts it, is that there are certain situations that you find yourself in, or we as collectively might find ourselves in, where we are impossibly morally required to do A and B. And if we choose A, we can no longer do B and vice versa. And by choosing A or B, it does not cancel the moral requirement to do the thing you didn't do. And she sort of sticks to her guns there by saying that these kinds of flourishing and suffering can never be reduced to, I pointed out in the article, to fungible assets. Like doing a math equation where you're trying to convert centimeters to inches, you could do that by appealing to some abstract number system, and then you do it. But you have to do that before you can. We all know that from mathematics. You have to get the same units on either side of the equation before you start your work. She says you can't do this, if it's my life compared to your life on the trolley problem. No matter what we do, we cannot actually philosophically bring those down to the same unit. And so this is sort of just fool's gold. And it's a way of saying that you're not just in a hard problem, you're in an impossible problem. And no matter what you choose, it will always be the wrong thing. And I find it, we could argue about philosophically whether it's sound or not, but psychologically, I find it very useful. A lot of people who are struggling with PTSD and have trouble talking about it, they may have been in war and faced incredibly awful, diabolical situations where they're looking through the sight of a gun or something, and there's a little kid with a bomb, and in a split second they have to decide, do I shoot this kid in the head to save the crowd of people that this kid is running into with the bomb strapped to their back, even if it was like some awful adult who made the kid do this thing. Like, these are terrible situations. And her answer really is like, that is an impossible situation, literally a philosophical impossible situation. And if it makes in her view, not just psychological sense that would be a very hard thing to deal with, but philosophical sense, when you come back and this thing is haunting you for years and years and years and you're having trouble getting over it. I think, to put on my psychologist hat, if this was my patient, someone who's dealing with this problem, you could say like, well, you did the right thing. Listen, you just killed one life and that kid was going to blow up the whole wedding party or whatever and kill 100. So you did the right thing. I find that, I'm guessing that is very unsatisfying to the person who went through it, and probably doesn't even feel right or real. And if you sort of take on the Lisa Tessman, the book that I'm referencing, by the way, is called When Doing the Right Thing is Impossible. If she was sort of in the psychologist seat, she might say, you know what, you actually did the wrong thing. But the truth is, there was no way you weren't going to do the wrong thing. And I find starting the conversation that way maybe can help people sort of not beat themselves up over making the wrong choice, because literally it was only wrong choices. And so that was a very long way of saying, I don't know the answer to somebody who wants to put themselves at risk right now. Like, I can't do anything like that. The hard problem of what you're describing and why this particular situation with the pandemic is so tricky is that by going out to the park or throwing a birthday party or whatever, it's not just them putting themselves at risk at the moment. It's also, they're including me in their risk, or they're including grandmothers, or they're including, immune susceptible people or whatever it is. And that complicates, I think, the picture to a severe degree. It's back to the Wendell Holmes thing. It's, if you want to go bungee jumping and you die, and you didn't check the harness or whatever, well, that was a risk you took and you suffered the consequences from it. It didn't put me at risk. If I think oh, that's a terrible idea, that's not safe, and then you're the one who suffers the consequences, well, you had the freedom to do it. But if you're a pilot and you're drunk and I'm in the back of the plane, you're not only just taking risk in your own hands. If you crash, you're going to die, but I might as well. And that feels a little more analogous to what we're going through right now with this pandemic. But some of that's a little overblown. If somebody wants to go to the park right now and practices social distancing, I feel like we're hyping it up too much. I think you're morally required to be aware of the situation at the moment and to, be as careful as you can be. But I'm not going overboard with chastising people who are, valuing their mental health in this grand trolley problem that I'm putting in as well, because those are real considerations as well. So I don't know. We all have to we all have to deal with that. It'd be interesting, or really, like, it just came to my mind, a weird dilemma to throw into it would be like, imagine a community where everybody knew all the risks. Let's just say like 50 people, and they all like signed up being like, yeah, I'll sign a waiver. We're good hanging out here. We're all going to go do this together, and we're only going to see each other for the next like year. Would we have a problem with everybody signing off with this like mutual risk? I don't know. I don't know. I don't know if that answered your question at all, but I ignored the moral requirement thing because I don't know how to do it.
I can understand, and I can even appreciate Tessman's view of the psychological effects that it would have on a person. I'm not quite sure I fully buy into it. I've always fully gone through with what Paul Bloom says, the psychologist at Yale, where part of moral progress is getting rid of the ick factor. So even though it might not be psychologically beneficial to the person who has to shoot the kid who was running with the bomb strapped onto his chest, even though he might be psychologically damaged for the rest of his life, I don't think what's wrong is his decision. As Testament would put it, that no matter what, you're always going to make the wrong decision. But I think rather our moral attitudes towards the way that we're reacting to it is going to be what's wrong. So, I mean, that's the way that I would view the situation. Again, I'm not moral philosophy, as you've mentioned, is really sticky, icky, and filled with semantic language. But I've always viewed moral situations in that. So I do take a sort of utilitarian viewpoint to society, where I do think at the end of the day, whether you like it or not, our general definition of morality that we could all agree on is just wanting to increase the well-being of society. So I very much follow in the lines of Sam Harris. So that's a huge line of contention. So again, if we're talking against someone like Jordan Peterson, he'd disagree with us heavily. But that's generally the way that I would view morality. Even if you're, for instance, a jihad that's trying to blow himself up in the nearest embassy to try to get the highest kill count, he's doing so under the impression that he's creating a better society for humanity. He's creating a better future. So at the end of the day, I think morality rests on that solid foundation. So that's usually my foundation. That's my starting point for morality. And when we get into the weeds with all these things, so for instance, you've likened the current situation with the coronavirus with whether or not we should take into consideration economic turmoil, or whether or not we should take into consideration the total mortality rate of the coronavirus. You likened it to the bridge scenario, the very famous bridge dilemma, which is kind of, people usually discuss it alongside the trolley problem. And we, with what recently Trump basically enacted, it people are going to think about this very deeply, or at least much more deeply than they originally would have thought. But when I was talking with Bruce over here, he brought up a very interesting sort of topic about democracy, liberal democracies, and how they fit into this equation. So Bruce, I'll let you take the stage for now. Yeah,
Jay, have you ever heard of an individual by the name of Carl Schmitt?
Yes.
He was, just for the audience here who might not know who this guy is, he was a political theorist, a jurist who was part of the Nazi theory, who excoriated liberalism, saying that it was a farce, the kind of democratic debates, the discussions about issues was just a show meant to the public, because when the shit hit the fan, things really went down, as we all know it is more or less going down right now with the coronavirus. Anyone who had the ability to declare emergency powers or to exercise a broad use of authority, in essence, has the final say in the situation. So we are, in some way or form, by default, under some kind of, I may be overstating it, but some kind of dictatorship, more or less. In times within the last 100 years, when the world has come under threat, liberal democracy gets decried. And you can make the argument that right now China has a fair amount of power in how it chooses to deal with the situation. It has a lot of its authoritarian tendencies, can put rules and regulations into place to strictly get people to social distance by very, very heavy-handed methods. Now, Trump isn't quite Hitler. He has certain tendencies, and his news appearances have just been a complete display of his utter narcissism. And we have leaders like Jair Bolsonaro who are even worse than he is, just saying that the disease is a farce or whatever. And doesn't this kind of put the spotlight on issues we face within liberal democracies, in which um, we are slow to respond to the issue because of whoever could potentially be in power in the face of disasters.
Yeah.
And I think one of your colleagues, someone you've spoken with before, Melissa Chen, stated that because of the issues with the regressive left and whatnot, China is being much more successful exporting its systems of government around the world than the United States is. So doesn't this kind of reveal a problem that's inherent to liberal democracies? And
yeah, this amongst other world shifts, I think, is a real challenge. Yeah. So to bring, I've been trying actually to write something about Carl Schmitt for a while. Who, yes, by the way, yes, was an actual Nazi. So when the regressive left calls everyone a Nazi, they actually got this one right with Carl Schmitt. He's actually a Nazi, but he, yeah, yes, you could actually punch Carl Schmitt. But as you were pointing out, he wasn't wrong about this note. So I've been trying to write this longer piece. Maybe I'll finally do it. Where I call it sort of a king switch in all of our heads. Like imagine like a little light switch in all of our heads that's in the off switch, because we don't like kings here in liberal democracies. This is like the thing we're trying to avoid. And I think rightfully so, the consolidation of power and knowledge in one person is a terrible idea for all kinds of reasons. It's what we've tried to resist at all causes here. Yes, and he points out that it is kind of, it's like cute that we all think that and believe that, but when you're scared, when the enemy's at the gates, everyone's got this king switch and they flip it in their heads. So I actually recently was trying to show some data of this king switch being real and noticing George W. Bush's approval rating on September 12th, 2001, which the day before, like September 10th, before the attacks, was like 48% or something. On September 12th, it hit like 91%. Like in one day, George W. Bush, who was not a popular president the day before the attack, was at 91%. That's a kind of king switch moment of like, oh shit, like whatever you need to do, dude. And we know what happened, which was a lot of like, hey, pass whatever you need to pass. It is a dangerous moment, as I'm not the first to point out. Yuval Harari has been making a lot of these sort of warnings as well of like, this is a delicate moment where we all are tempted to hand over and cede a lot of sort of control to central governments, or it doesn't even need to be governments. I'll get to that point later, but central powers, as it were, to take care of us and protect us, whatever that means. And okay, so I worry about it, and here's what I worry about in particular. I think the coronavirus is just part of this larger trend, but I have a whole thought experiment of why I think China and systems like that are quite, we have to talk about them. We can't just dismiss their closedness or like laugh them off as sort of they're going to collapse the way that the Soviet Union collapsed or anything. They won't. And again, to bring in Yuval Harari, he makes this point often that the reason the Soviet Union collapsed, or East Germany or any of these places, was that it was really just not feasible to have that kind of crazy surveillance and oversight over all of your citizens. Imagine the kind of bureaucracy you would need to spy on every single East German citizen. Like there was spies for the spies for the spies. You just run out of numbers and your economy crashes because you're paying people to just watch people. And they just sort of fail on their own. And predictably, you didn't have to push them. They didn't have to do anything. You could just wait it out and let them collapse under the weight of their own sort of very cumbersome way to solve problems, which was much, much slower than even our messy, democratic, let's all debate it out and try to get our best answer way. But that is no longer true. And it's not necessarily anything to do with this virus, but it's now feasible to do the kinds of things that East Germany and the Soviet Union wanted to do with even weak AI and these kind of surveillance programs we have. So here's an example that I've been trying to think of. I don't know if this is a perfect analogy, but imagine different classrooms at a university, and each classroom will have a different kind of political structure of how they answer questions and answer problems. And let's say the professor walks in, there's a different professor in each class, and he walks in at the same exact moment, and the professor asks the class the question of how old I am exactly, like to the second, at this exact moment. And then he like hits his watch for their answer. That's it. So this, I'm asking the question of how old am I? What's my exact age? Because that's something that's objective and true. So let's start with that there is a right or wrong answer, and it's just sort of a math time one. So now imagine like classroom number 1 has a system where they're like, oh, we answer our questions by letting the bloodline of this one family answer it, and it's that kid. So he's the one who answers it because his father and his grandfather was the ruler and blah, 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 blah. Sort of a kingship type thing. And that kid, whoever it is who has the right last name at that moment, answers the question, which looks at the person and gives their guess. In another classroom, let's say it's a group of the smart. Let's say it's the smartest kid in the room who is like gets A's in all of the tests, and they're like, oh, let him answer it. He's the smartest guy in here. He's going to answer it, and they answer it that way. Let's say there's another room that does sort of just like a random row does it. You go on and on and on. And then let's say there's a room that works a little bit like an open democracy, like you're asking about, that says, oh, cool, we're all going to debate this and we're going to like vote on what we think is the best answer. We're going to elect representatives, whatever it can be. It's going to be very messy. We're all going to argue over how old this professor actually is and make arguments of like, oh, he's got gray hair over here. So it's going to be messy. There's going to be campaigns, whatever it is, but they'll eventually come out with an answer. And then, and before I give you the last room, which I'm sure you've already could guess how it would work, but that room actually, it turns out, it's tapping into this phenomenon that we don't even fully totally understand, but called the wisdom of the crowds. There was an old famous, I don't even know if it's true anymore, but this guy who brought a cow to like carnivals, and you had to guess the weight of the cow. And the best answer was always asking the entire crowd, and the wisdom of the crowd, the mean answer was the one that was closest to the actual weight of the cow. And that's basically what democracy and open democracy has been thriving on, is this notion of the wisdom of the crowd, that if we spread the knowledge throughout society and just sort of get the best amorphous, almost libertarian ethic of what comes out of that to be the right answer, it's honestly usually the best answer until now. Because in that last classroom, imagine they had just a weak AI little system there that could scan this guy and do all of its math, and it had all of the data of everybody in the world or in the room, and could it doesn't even need to be causal smart AI, but just doing what's the word I'm looking for? Associations and not causations, but correlations between the amount of gray hair and where he came from, whatever, and it spits out a number, which would be very, very good. And it did it probably within a picosecond. That is basically what China is trying to do. There's no voting on it. There's no how old is this guy, and now pretend that answer wasn't something as trivial and silly as the age of a professor, but something that actually was hugely consequential about the future of the economy, or the price of some mineral that they were putting out or something. I think that's a game changer as far as the feasibility of authoritarian systems that are trying to run the way that China is trying to run. I shudder to think what a regime like Nazi Germany, or even East Germany after the war, would have done with the kind of technology that China has. I mean, we haven't even mentioned what China is doing to the Muslims in the camps there. And forever now, it feels like that's obviously a huge backseat to something like coronavirus. And as you point out, I think in your question, this maybe cruel irony that precise system seems to be, and maybe a culture of trusting that system, is so much more effective at stamping out a pandemic or a challenge that requires rapid communal cooperation, which East Asian countries, whether it's Singapore, which doesn't have quite like a system like that, it might just be a cultural sort of norm, as Vince was saying earlier. It's a strength, not a weakness in this point, at this moment. We're in a real challenge, and I think the challenge started before this pandemic, about just the rise of a system like China, where you just, like I said, you could no longer just assume that because we use the wisdom of the crowd's messy liberal democracy thing, we're getting better answers than them. It's just not necessarily true on massively consequential answers. So to throw even just one more thing in, Hans Rosling, who was one of my favorite statisticians and economists, he died a few years ago, unfortunately. He was sort of a Steve Pinker in that mold of using graphs to show how the world is getting better, and he wrote all these incredible books about that kind of stuff. In his last book, which his kids actually helped finish, Factfulness, he starts the book by talking about China, where we can no longer in liberal democracies say that if your country is trying to get from poor and unhealthy, that part of the graph, to rich and healthy, basically just GDP per capita and life expectancy, if you plot all of the countries in the world on a graph that looks like that, and the bottom left would be poor and sick, and the top right would be wealthy and healthy, it's just not true that liberal democracies is even the most efficient way to get from the bottom left of that graph to the top right of that graph. And that's a fairly new dynamic for the world. And if we're going to defend liberal democracy, we can't just do it based on the data of the output. We have to do it on more philosophical grounds that it is a more moral way to arrange society, which is a harder conversation to do, because maybe counter to what Vince is suggesting, you can't just look at the flourishing and suffering data and spit out an answer the way that I think we used to, and take that for granted.
There's actually a lot to unpack there, because I'm very familiar with Steven Pinker's work, and after reading his books, Enlightenment Now and Better Angels Over Nature, I've become something of a cautious optimist. And Yuval Noah Harari is someone who's come onto the stage within the last several years. I've been following his books very, very closely, and he makes the argument that liberal democracies, this idea that had its genesis from a few hundred years ago to now, may not be what is necessary to propel us into the future, because of the advances in AI and the ability it has to intrude not just in our professional lives, but also in our personal lives, when it goes into the area of being able to see our biometric data, to see how we react emotionally, and to sort out what we prefer to search, sort of give us the news that we choose to consume. It's a very, very real threat to liberalism, because liberalism relies on intellectualism. And I don't want to just bring up the threat of China, but it seems like some of the concepts that are eroding our idea of how democracies work, and even our economic systems, are coming into play. With the coronavirus, again, with this worldwide pandemic threat coming into the picture, it's very, very interesting to me to see how Andrew Yang's ideas of more or less UBI is coming into the center stage. And it's even more interesting to see how many right wingers are now saying, "Yeah, let's go for it." And it's like this turns everything on its head. It seems like we still want to. I would strongly argue we still need the foundational principles and ideas behind the Enlightenment to take center stage, but it seems like one way or another, the idea behind liberal democracies has to change and morph to take these new ideas, these new circumstances, these new technologies into play. And it's really up in the air as to what shape that's going to take in the 21st and 22nd centuries. And I don't know what the 22nd century part.
Well, Yuval Harari, as a historian, does think in those terms, which I really like. Yeah. But one thing to throw in there, and I'll bring in another. There's another one of our guests who I love a lot, named Matthew B. Crawford, who brings up. He writes these books. He wrote a book called Shop Class as Soulcraft, which was a big seller, and then another book that I loved called The World Beyond Your Head. And in it, especially The World Beyond Your Head, he makes a plea for something that he's sort of calling libertarianism 2.0. You said something in there in your talk about the foundations of liberal democracy, or let's just call it small L libertarianism, or classical liberals, whatever people are calling themselves these days. Again, I think the definitions are beside the point, but with the foundation, I've made this point before, but I'm getting it from him, that I think libertarianism and let's call it the American story of pushing back against tyranny and all this, has sort of a fetish and a nostalgia for authoritarian governments being the big bad guy. And maybe for good reason. I mean, they have been the ones with the guns, and those are the ones who enacted a lot of horrors. Where, if to your point, if the foundations of liberalism and liberal democracy are avoiding systems of the centralization and isolation of power and knowledge in a society, like if the foundations are rejecting authoritarian notions of knowledge and truth and morality and whatever it is, which most often are manifested in the form of government. The American Revolution manifested in King George as, oh, like this is the authority and we're rejecting it. And we're going to spread that authority somehow throughout something where, and honestly, and anytime it starts to sort of congeal around one person or one thought or one party, we get very worried. And I think we should. But I think what libertarianism, so knowing those foundations of just you're concerned about knowledge and truth and power congealing in one place where then it cannot be questioned, or it's just too powerful to question, something like that. You could go out and get a gun and become a Second Amendment nut and be afraid of like the government being that place that you're one day going to have to fight. But I think what's missing in the conversation right now, and what I think Yuval sort of gets to there, although it could be governments, is that power and that knowledge could congeal in the private sector just as easily, if not now more easily. Like, do you think Facebook, well, most people are on it now, or Twitter or Facebook or social media companies have more knowledge about you than like your local police department? I mean, the answer is like certainly yes. And are they concerned about that? And maybe we're not at that point yet. You brought up the 22nd century, so we'll see how far it goes. But if that situation starts to happen where companies, you're mentioning companies and with algorithmic sort of nudges towards what you see, the kind of media you consume, what you're buying, what kind of ideas that you're expressing, whatever it is, if that starts being used to manipulate society in a certain way, that even if it's something as simple as like selling shoes, if it's like Nike has all your data and now everybody's buying Nike because their algorithms are so good that they can nudge everybody in that direction, I don't see any other entity that could step in between you and this congealment, if that's a word, of power and influence over you other than regulation, which is usually the big bad word for libertarians, is that you might need something like the government or at least associations to actually protect you from the places that have power, which is a very, as you're saying, like different conception of what it's looked like, but actually does nothing to the foundations of liberalism. The foundations of liberalism, as you pointed out, are totally intact there. You're actually still worried about the same thing, which is about power and knowledge and influence congealing in one spot where it cannot be questioned. So I think, yes, worrying about that happening in governments is obvious, and we should always be worried about that. But it ought to be equally, if not more, concerned about where else that might congeal with private corporations and that kind of those kind of conversations. So I'm with you. I think liberalism, and it's why I think I'm a critic of it, because I do see these blind spots in it, and the ideas are good, the ideas are sound, but the way that they're manifested are blind. And there's just blind spots throughout all of it, which almost always happen because of our sort of priors of what we dealt with before. If we're worried about the king ruling us, I'm not so sure that that's still sort of the thing to be overly concerned about. And you shouldn't get conspiratorial about this. It's just as we're pointing out, the foundations of liberalism are just being concerned about all of this, and the erosion between private sector having influence and our government is obviously something people have been talking about for 30 something years, but I think is still an underrated point about the influence of money in our politics and all that kind of stuff. So I might not even be making a point that feels very new at this stage, because they are sort of you know, maybe is still a common enemy is that Coca-Cola has influence over politics is a problem, right? Like that's just seems like an obvious problem to us. So, yeah.
Well, the one that has mostly concerned me over the last couple of years is the influence of social media, like the way how Facebook filters what you can say and think, and there's definitely a left-leaning bias in several of these fields.
Yeah.
It gets into, but then again, on the other hand, we have someone like Trump in our government, which is incredibly problematic.
But even just to throw one more thing in that point, because I think it's even more complicated to bring in our earlier discussion about the essay that I wrote and indirect causes and sort of shared risk. I didn't write about it in that article in particular, but talking about going out to the park right now and throwing a barbecue with a bunch of friends, and then one of your friends comes and you high five and he gets it, and you're both asymptomatic, which is a strange thing, but you both have it or something, or you gave it to him, and then he goes and hangs out with his grandmother, and then his grandmother dies a week from now, and there's some invisible culpability happening there that you'll never be able to trace. But throwing the barbecue was a bad idea because look what it led to, right? Like from some God's eye view, you would see that. There's a way to use what I just said in a very sort of left wing, maybe regressive left way to stifle free speech that we also, maybe as people who don't love those arguments, need to contend with better than laughing them off. Because how about this one? What if I say, well, I'm going to hold a free speech kind of event here at my college campus, and I'm going to invite someone whose ideas, I don't really agree with, but let's say it's Milo or whoever, I don't even know his views that well, someone who ruffles a lot of feathers. And if 1,000 people show up at this event, and even just one of them gets the idea at this event from what was said on stage to go do some violence or something, are you as the event organizer indirectly sort of responsible? Was that a risk in some way that's analogous to throwing a barbecue at the park? Like that argument is, I think, not even a bad argument. It just goes to maybe sort of, Vince, your analysis and your criticism that you like of, we need to take a utilitarian sort of scale to that problem and say that is a risk. That is a risk, and it's a risk that we're actually going to take on, because the benefits and the flourishing of having a society that has open speech and free speech codes actually, in the end, is more flourishing than suffering. The difficult conversations of moral philosophy in all of these conversations is that there's no utopias. Every single thing you do is going to incur risks. And so the fact that now throwing a barbecue in the middle of a pandemic and inviting your friends over who all say, hey, I'm feeling fine, I'm going to show up, incurs a risk is not even necessarily, this is why it's so tricky for people, I think, right now, and me included. It's not even new. It's basically the same argument that I just made about a free speech rally of like, oh, that's risky. Someone might get a bad idea and go beat someone up or shoot someone or worse, right? Like, don't do it. It's not actually even new. But the only thing that's different now is the risks are a little higher, and we can calculate them more, and they're present. But it's actually not that new of a challenge for us to think about or deal with. So I worry. This is to the point that brings a lot of this conversation together. That there is an opening here for totalitarian left wing, like stamping out of free speech kind of codes using this same argument. So we're still in the disaster. We're still in the pandemic. We just have to get through it. But coming out of it is going to be very delicate. And of course, there's also a right-wing version of it as well. But we're going to have to be very delicate coming out of this, because we're going to have to admit, as people who want to retain and ought to want to retain an open, free society, that yes, we are vulnerable. We're vulnerable to ourselves in that society always. But we think it's worth it. And we're going to have to do our best to mitigate those harms as much as we can, but we're not going to give it up, and we shouldn't give it up. Obviously, people are fetishizing that right now to a ridiculous degree. Some people on the right, of flaunting these stay-at-home codes in some weird political gesture. I think it's just ridiculous. But we're going to have that argument, maybe hopefully sooner than later, but at least in a few months, we're going to have to really have these delicate conversations about how do we step back out into society, knowing there's risks beyond just the pandemic coming back, and be honest about them and be okay with them. I brought up in the piece, just one more thing before you go, that this Overton window idea, because really everything to talk about that what you're doing holds a potential to kill people is outside of the Overton window. People just aren't comfortable with those kind of conversations. They're not comfortable doing the kind of math that you're saying, where you're incurring these risks. Everybody's calling everybody a murderer right now, and we're going to have to get used to, I think, talking outside of the Overton window, and we're not used to it at all. And we're definitely, this is a different conversation, but our schooling system is not preparing kids to have these conversations at all. This is a John Haidt thing, but coddling them in the worst possible way to actually deal with these complications. It's just totally taboo to talk about something like, yeah, we're doing something that might put people in harm's way, but we think it's worth it. Like, that's, for high school kids or younger, is out of bounds. Like, you're a moral monster for it. And that's a lot to throw out there at you, but I'm worried about the next few months from now, for sure.
I completely agree with you, because it's like, one of the things you said in your article is that when we back out of this, we will have to somehow take liberty back to some degree.
Yeah.
But the media, our society right now is so polarized, and this is one of the beefs I have with Jordan Peterson's philosophy, is that how humans are driven more by narrative, and we need some kind of narrative in our lives, which I'm partial to that agreement. But these narratives tend to hijack our humans' moral senses. We're talking about Jonathan Haidt, where we're driven more by the elephant rather than the rider.
Right.
And we have an election coming up in the next couple of months, and whoever controls the narrative is going to can do a real number on a democracy when we come out of it. So, for better or worse, we have to be very, very careful about how we decide to direct the development of liberalism, so to speak, as what happens in the future.
Yeah. Well, careful is good. I don't know if I have any answers for it, but so I don't want to talk about Jordan Peterson so much directly, because he just gets me off in different directions. But I think generally there's two ways to really the topic that I think you and I are on at the moment. There's always, in my mind, two directions to go, where we're talking about the collision of human psychology and sort of what works. You brought up, well, we've talked about John Haidt and Paul Bloom and these people. Like John Haidt, and I he's a psychologist, and I agree with him, is we probably think that we're in charge of our emotions much more than we are. We're really good post hoc rationalizers of what we do, and we're really good at coming up with reasons for what we just did, and then we're going to pretend like we came up with it before. And so Paul Bloom's against empathy. Maybe you've read it. You know his argument against empathy. There's this one little. I think he may have done the study. I don't want to put this at his lab or not, but it's my favorite silly little anecdote and study in the book that just worked so well for me that if your listeners haven't read it, I'll just do it here because it's pretty quick. It's just a really simple donation game in a psychology lab. So you would come into the lab, and the entire game is I give you $100. And I say, okay, here's your $100 is yours. And I have 20 random numbers behind me that all represent people in this jar. Imagine just like a lottery kind of jar or whatever. I have 20 random numbers in here, 1 to 20. And what I want you to do is decide how much money you're going to donate of the 100. You could give whatever you want, 0 to 100. And we're going to select a number, and we'll give them the money that you gave, and they'll never know how much you started with. And people are sort of like, I don't know, here's a little money, and they give $20, $30, whatever on average. And then you stir it up and you pick out a number. So let's say you give 30, and then I stir it up and I pick out number 17. And then I'm like, cool, here's your $20. And I give it to number 17, who never sees you, never knows. And they never know how much you started with. And they're like, oh, cool, $30. Everyone's happy, they walk away. And then that's one group. The other group, the only manipulation you do in the experiment is, I give you the $100. I say, how much do you want to donate? I say, I have 20 names here, or not names. I have 20 numbers here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick one randomly, and then I dig through it and I pick out number 7. And I'm like, okay, cool. Number 7. How much do you want to give to number 7? So all I did in that one is ask you for the donation after I picked the number. And people, it's a fairly large effect, give way more money when they know the number first, because they're imagining number 7, whatever number 7 means to them. I don't know, like they give, and it's like 30% more money or whatever when they know the number first, rather than some amorphous, I'm just giving money to some fund or something. They're like, oh, it's going to number 7. And that's just a number. If I gave a name, if I'm like, oh, you're giving it to Bruce, Bruce is getting it, how much do you want to give Bruce? It would be even higher. And this donation game taps into, and as he points out, his book is called Against Empathy. This is, and I think you made this point earlier, is probably a bug in our moral software rather than a feature, because of course it makes no moral sense. It's not rational at all that just knowing the name of the person first means you're going to give more money. But we know this is how charities work, right? Like if I'm trying to raise money for coronavirus right now, and I tell you, 900 people died in New York yesterday, you'll give what you give. But if I tell you, here's the story of Sally, and she's a grandmother, and here's the picture and the video of her choking and dying last night, and her family crying behind the pane of glass because she couldn't get to them, you'll give more to the one person rather than the 900. So again, he points all this out as, again, truths about our human psychology that evolved for very obvious and good reasons, for kinship and to take care of people who looked like you when we were evolving as earlier animals, or who were near you and had the same voice as you. There's all kinds of reasons for this, but actually, aren't probably the most moral foundations that we want to move forward with. So we have some options of sort of acknowledging that all that is true, and that we're tribal animals, and that we have these biases built into us, and trying to acknowledge that stuff, understand it as much as we can, and then harness it for good and point it in some moral direction. Or you try to just ignore it all and stamp it out and say like, oh, tribalism sucks, and like we shouldn't be tribal, and we should all be robots in some way. Of course, Paul understands that is a very tricky. I think it's much easier to go the first route than the second route, and his entire book is about ways to maybe try to find that middle ground or hack our sort of psychology in order to mitigate some of these bugs that we have. Something like bringing in, Finland to talk about the peace process between the Palestinians and the Israelis is one of those ideas, being like, oh, they're probably not biased. Let's like ask them and bring other people into this room. So we use these kind of hacks and tricks all the time. And so, I don't know how we turn it around. I'm a big fan of Amy Chua and her book, Political Tribes, which talks a lot about this idea of how we sort of harness tribalism for good, and that we really should understand it rather than try to just operate as if it's a bad idea and people can just walk away from it. She writes a lot about sports, which is something that I'm a big believer in bringing people together, like super narratives and meta narratives. And in the US at the moment, the meta narrative of America and what it means to be an American is very strained. When we talk about polarization right now, maybe and listen, I don't know Jordan's philosophies probably as well as you do, but to defend it, I think the meta narrative of what it means to be an American splitting so violently, it seems, in this country, maybe traced back to Vietnam, but very badly, and obviously since the Trump election, I think is really a crisis in that of what is the narrative here. And I think you get a drastically different answer to that question in different political tribes at the moment. And if we can find things that can sort of overcome that and be meta narratives that bring everybody under the same boat to root for the same thing. Sports are silly. They're not rational either. Like I'm rooting for somebody who's wearing the right laundry running around a field or something. But if they're, if that's a way that I can high five, I'm a Philadelphia Eagles fan. When they won the Super Bowl, I was in Philadelphia with my buddy and cheering and like crying and going nuts, hugging strangers in the bar. I could have been hugging a Trump supporter. Like I didn't care at that moment because we were all Philadelphia Eagles fans. And it was a kind of, super narrative that overcame those other things. And, if I can hug a Trump fan and because he's an Eagles fan, maybe there's hope that we can try to, I don't know, heal those divides. You would think something as life and death as a pandemic would do it, but I'm yes, already maybe a little dismayed that it doesn't. It seems to still be flourishing and maybe even getting worse, which is terrible in a pandemic. That like Democrats are taking it more seriously than Republicans. It's like awful data coming out right now. I don't know.
That's an interesting thing to bring up, though, the dichotomy between good tribalism versus bad tribalism, where we can point at things like political tribes or even religious tribes and be able to easily outline all the bad things that come from that level of tribalism, from in-group thought and out-group hostility. But there's also the good aspects of tribalism, like what about sort of communal things like sports? And so that's an interesting thing that I've been battling myself with lately because I've always been very antagonistic towards tribalism. I think one of them, and I've mentioned on this podcast before, one of the greatest evils I think that exists in society today is religion, and one of the reasons for that is because it's very staunch focus on tribalism. But I've also been struggling with myself. Well, what about the good things that come from it? What about the good things that come from, as you've mentioned, enjoying a sports team or joining a book club or going to the movies? Are these aspects of tribalism that we should sort of teach ourselves to outgrow? Because where evolutionarily speaking, at one point it was of course adaptive, but maybe it's become maladaptive at this point, or maybe it's something important to preserve in today's society. And I don't know the answer. I'm still of the mind that there are clear-cut cases of tribalism that need to be stomped out, that we need to evolve past towards, and these are, of course, as I've mentioned, political tribalism and religious tribalism. But who knows? There could be good aspects to it as well.
Yeah.
Well, one of the philosophers I've been studying recently, I wasn't going to bring it up here, but now it seems to be a good time to segue to that. Are you both familiar with Peter Singer's work?
Yeah.
Yeah, he wrote a book that had to deal with sociobiology a while back and argued that tribalism is something we're just not going to get away from. It's not going to happen because we've evolved to have feelings of altruism more to people who are closer to us, more in our kin group. And I think he makes the argument that later on down the line, because of our capacity to reason, we start coming up with moral philosophies that go beyond our tribe, and we start fixing rules and ideas as to how we believe the world will should operate. But when it really comes down to it, when you're in the middle of a trolley problem, and it's not just the idea of pushing someone over to save a greater number of people, you could potentially be shoving your own grandmother onto the train tracks to save another life, and most people, myself included, probably are not going to be able to do that. Now, he makes the argument that that's inescapable, so we should gear our social systems in order to work along those regards to at least give us the foundation, the general ideas as to how we would like society to operate by taking into account impartial considerations, but also realizing that's something we're never going to get away from.
I don't. Yeah, I mean, it's like the expanding moral arc kind of idea of you can start. I mean, I'll see if I could get to the answer because I am also, as you probably know, a huge critic of religion. But I think I could try to dig into what I think bad tribalism versus good tribalism is, or the foundations of what would be guaranteed to be a bad tribe. Let's put it that way, because I don't know the other ways to say it. But before I try that though, the expanding moral arc, if we say we're not going to get away from tribalism, that the goal should try to be how do we expand that tribe as big as possible. And this is another Yuval Harari point. We've actually come a long way. And people who are afraid of this word globalism or whatever, we've come a long way, even from your little family tribe to your religion tribe to your state tribe to your national tribe. I mean, we've expanded it rather rapidly, and it might have expanded a little too quickly. That we're seeing a little pullback recently, I would say, in the last 50 years of the species. But if the goal is to admit our tribalism, obviously an alien invasion in Hollywood films is the thing that reminds everybody, hey, you're all in the same tribe, you're all human. I mean, that's a kind of tribe in the universe. We're different than the tribe of the invading alien, as it were. And it seems to work there. We're sort of facing that now with the pandemic. You would think it's an alien organism. But to the point about religion and good tribalism versus bad tribalism or whatever it is, I mean, why I think the tribalism that is fueled by religion in the abstract is guaranteed to eventually be harmful is that, and this might require two esoteric conversations, but religion as a way of knowing versus science as a way of knowing, religion inherently is not pointed towards the universe that we actually live in. It's not a way of knowing through you could call it the scientific method, but just the philosophy of science of what's that? Yeah, it's a fantasy or it's a hope. Like, here's another analogy. Imagine one day you wiped all your memories. You didn't know who you were or anything, and then you wake up and you're suddenly in a strange room. You've never been in this place. You look down, you see your hands. You're like figuring out. You basically have total amnesia, and you're in a strange room, and it's kind of dark. Pause right there, because actually, that's kind of how it feels to be a conscious creature in this thing that we call life. Is one day I just sort of opened my eyes and here I was. I mean, so I actually haven't said anything that's strange yet when you just sort of broaden it. I didn't choose to be here and suddenly here I am, right? And so imagine you're in this strange room. You have no idea how you got there. You don't know where you are at all. And you start naturally trying to figure those things out of where am I? Who am I? How did I get in here? And you start looking at things and you start, touching the walls and you start piecing things together and you start coming up with, this is just still science now, you come up with possible answers. You might come up with what David Deutsch calls a conjecture. You can conjecture maybe I'm in here because I did something bad and maybe I could just leave. Maybe the door's unlocked, and then you go to the door and it's locked or whatever. And then you're like, you have to change that conjecture. And let's say you're looking through this house and you open up a closet and you find like a fireman's outfit in there or something, like a fireman's jacket, and it's a little charred or something. It's a very interesting like object. And so you naturally start coming up with conjectures that would explain how this jacket got there. And you're like, oh, maybe the guy who owned this house was a firefighter and he died. And you would come up with some sort of fantasy or whatever it was, right? And then maybe if that's what you knew. And at this point, you're still doing science. You're literally looking around your environment, trying to collect the data from it and conjecturing something, or going the other way, conjecturing something and then seeing if the data matches it. This is still just you doing science of trying to answer who you are, where you are. And let's then say you start looking around and there's a bunch of other people in the house that you notice for the first time. And some of them have ideas about why we're all in the house and what we're supposed to be doing in here. And then you notice, and this is the big kicker, that there's a door, and when someone walks out the door, they never seem to come back. And that's like one of these, so you're like, that's weird. This would be the equivalent to death, as it were, as in our world. And so that's a strange door. And you're like, I wonder what this door is about. Like, what's happening on the other side outside? You could look through the windows a little bit, but you can't really see anything. So you have all these stories. But let's say everybody like has been there a while and they're like, oh, we know the story. It's the fireman is sort of the guy who owns the house, and we're all in here. We don't know what happens when you leave the house, but we think like the fireman's wife is waiting outside to like take care of you, and it's a party. You just have to sort of wait it out. And you're like, oh, I don't think that story is really real. And they're like, well, how do you know? And then let's say you find a new room in the house, and there's a photo album in the room, and you're leafing through the photo album, and you find a picture of that firefighter's outfit, and the guy in it waving is not the guy everyone thought it was. Let's say it's actually like the uncle of the story that everyone said. Well, now you're faced with a problem. Everybody's got a story about why they're in the house, and you just found a piece of evidence that destroys that hypothetical, that conjecture of that piece of evidence. You're now, I would say, if you're doing science and you're genuinely interested in why you're in this house, you have two choices. Cling to your idea, cling to your story. You could call it a fantasy, as it were, that somehow makes it true, or you update your story. I think we're always going to be telling stories about why we're here. Science is a story. We're trying to tell the story of why we're here. Cosmology is the study of how this whole thing started, and we're still trying to piece together the story from the evidence. It's like coming across a crime scene and trying to figure out what happened at the crime. You're coming up with a story, and what you hope, if you're doing science, if you're sciencing, is what you're trying to do is hope that your story matches the reality. And you come up with a story, and if you find evidence that refutes that story, you throw out that story and you try to find something new. And the story is elaborate and it's intricate, but there's really only two options. It's either you are trying to tell stories that explain or match the world that you actually find yourselves in, which is science, or you're not, which is religion. and religion is a way of knowing that rejects the entire thing that I just said by basically saying, you don't need to look around this house anymore because we know why we're here. And I don't care the kind of evidence that you find in this house. When I leave that door, it's, Chuck E. Cheese or whatever you say outside the door. And no matter what you find, no matter what you say, I just don't feel that. And that's something to contend with. They'll just say like, well, I just don't feel like that's true. This is all an illusion, or it's a test, or someone's here trying to fool you, or whatever it is. And honestly, at that point, you just have to sort of drift away. But if you're going to build a tribe in that house, back to your this is like an elaborate analogy. If you're going to build a tribe in that house that's dedicated to hypotheses of why you are in the house, that cannot be refuted by anything in the house and cannot even be confirmed by anything in the house, you are inherently sectioning off that tribe from everybody else in the house who ever hopes to be in it that is going to look around. So like the only thing that could potentially be a unifying tribe in that house would be people looking at the house. It's like if the bullseye is over here and we're all trying to hit it, we're all going to meet each other no matter what. And if the bullseye is the genuine true story of what the hell is happening in this thing called consciousness and life, we're actually going to meet each other. So you could call that kind of thing a tribalism, as it were, of being unified by a sort of beautiful, amazing, magical, without the religion, effort to explain this mystery of life. I find the religious rejection of that effort to be so philosophically pessimistic, as David Deutsch says, that we cannot possibly answer it. This is like the Adam and Eve story with the apple. That's not knowledge for you to have. God has a plan always. You're never going to know it. Is just so philosophically pessimistic. And frankly, without wanting to sound too condescending, I feel incredibly sorry for people who are entrapped in religion by being denied the amazing gift of actually trying to answer the puzzle of the universe. Because what could possibly be more interesting than trying to figure out what the hell is going on? and there's so much more to try to figure out. So that I hope is a long, elaborate way to say religious tribes, of course, are so damaging because of all of their violence and out-group hostility, but that's not necessarily unique to them. Even sports, we can see fights that happen in parking lots. Like, tribes can go wrong in a lot of different ways, but religious tribes, the foundations of them are literally, I'm not saying that facetiously, literally hopeless to be globally unifying or universally unifying tribes, and they're inherently unstable because we're going to find out more information. That's what they've always failed to do, is we're going to find out more information, and you're going to have trouble fitting it into your story because there's no way you're right, and there's no way even we're right with our story. When Galileo did his math and was like, "Hey guys, pretty sure the sun's in the middle, not the earth," the church had no option other than to threaten to cut his head off and call him a heretic and put him in jail, because that did not fit their story. Now they've weakened their grip to their literalism a bit to try to mesh that with their story, which is nice, but eventually it's going to break, and eventually it won't be satisfying for people. So, and that's also a long, elaborate way to say, like, I don't think we're ever going to be done with religion, unfortunately. People will always come up with new stories that don't match reality and have religious adherence to them that then shut themselves off to future information. But yes, they're hopeless to be unifying tribes. There you go.
I love that analogy what you put out there, because again, we're circling back around to Yuval Harari's book, the works in which he's talking about intersubjective realities, like ideas that are ideas nonetheless of how to live, but they at the very least are somehow rooted in reality itself. And if we take your analogy and have the ability to look at things through the lens of seeking objective truth, we have the capacity to draw people together. And Nicholas Christakis in his book Blueprint makes the argument that where certain ideologies and tribes and religions draw lines and walls, we have the capacity to draw bigger circles. we're heading towards globalism and in a rapidly shrinking 21st century world. There's no way to get around it. So I remain a cautious optimist.
Yeah, I mean, me too. Even in the midst of this pandemic, I was gonna say, I think religion, again, as a way of, we could talk about specific religious tribes as well, but religion as a way of sort of operating when it comes to life and death. Like most people are choosing to listen to the science at the moment rather than sort of a religious story about. I mean, the germ theory of disease is probably what you're going with right now if you're really concerned about you living or someone you love living. I think there's a lot of posturing happening about religion and God at the moment, but when push comes to shove, when it comes to survival, it has a way to cut through a lot of the bullshit, and science is the thing that again, as a way of knowing, and it's incomplete. Science makes all kinds of mistakes, especially in healthcare. It's what people are going to. If I can tell you I have the answer of how you're going to stay alive, and it's a scientific answer, you're gonna take it over a prayer. I'm sure. I'm almost sure. I'm not 100% sure, but most people will.
One of the responses that I always have to religious apologists like Ben Shapiro have is when they say, well, people need these communal things, these things to sort of share stories, share a culture, is that, well, whether you like it or not, the supernatural aspects of religion specifically are going down, and the number of nuns is increasingly exponentially as the years go by. So no matter what, if we're defining religion that way, supernaturally speaking, I do think religion is eventually going to die to the point where finding a religious person is almost as rare as finding someone who believes in the Greek gods. So no matter what, we need to find something to replace it with, whether we like it or not. And so it's always strange for me seeing these people dying on this specific hill, and I'm like, it's strange. Yeah, but this is officially.
Go ahead.
Oh, you were saying, sorry.
No, there's like the deep reasons for religion. I probably disagree. Well, it depends how we define it. That religion finding a religious person, I think religion will not go away so easily. I think it's going to be there's new forms of religion that sort of take over, but I'm defining it very broadly as
Are you referring also to like as if we were to define like the regressive left, for instance, and its religious tendencies, like if we're defining that as a religion?
Yeah, I'm equating atheism with just sort of genuine adherence to science, like a strict adherence to an honest exploration to the universe we find ourselves in, an agnostic one in the small a version of it, that we don't know the answers or where it's going to lead us, but we are, the word philosophy, when you break it down in the Greek, means love of wisdom when you break down the actual thing. And I think I think sometimes in the atheistic community, we shy away from poetic language a little too much, because I actually think atheism as truly defined is an incredibly beautiful and poetic, emotional journey, because it is the universe that we're actually in. And as I'm sure you've talked about on the show before, it's the view that accepts death as a genuine, real thing. It's the one back to my weird analogy of the house and the room, it's the one that says when the door opens and you don't come back, I don't know what happens. And we're just calling that death. And we can talk about it in many different ways. It's the one view that acknowledges that is a real, genuine thing, which inherently injects the preciousness to life back in it, because it injects that this is a strange, short as it can be, mystery that you're trying to put the puzzle pieces together somehow while you're here, but then it'll end. And I think for a lot of the reason religion won't go away is that is rather hard and scary for a lot of people. Probably, even for a lot of people who claim to be atheists or they don't follow a religion. I think latching on to even something, and again, like the regressive left or SJWism, or whatever we're going to call it, is a religion in the sense that it doesn't, it's not an honest investigation into the evidence. It's faith before science, and they have the answer before they're going out for the evidence. So you're doing bad science, as it were. But I think even in that, when you dig hard enough into the weeds of philosophy, I think maybe all bad science, whenever you're going in hoping to get the answer before you do the experiment, your hope is most often grounded, of course, in the way that you want the universe to be, which it just does not adhere to what we want it to be. It is what it is, and it's up to us to figure it out. So I think religion as maybe an organizing principle around supernatural claims, it might crumble. Finding someone who literally believes that Jesus rose from the dead might become more and more rare. But I think you're going to continue to find different New Age religions that are popping up. Quantum physics is very weird and very crazy, and you're going to get all kinds of interpretations of it that somehow inject order into what appears to be chaos, because it's very... What's that? Yeah. So I think religion as a again, broadly speaking, as a way of knowing, as it were, although I don't think they can know anything through religion, won't go away so easily. And it might become harder and more difficult to contend with, because it's not going to be as easy as finding the people who have funny hats. It's going to be within society in very just hard to decipher and hard to locate ways. David Deutsch, who I write about all the time and talk about as my favorite thinker all the time, I think has this just dead right when he talks about philosophical pessimism. And I mentioned it once here before, but I really think it's the view of humanity. It's a denial of our abilities, and a denial that we are a kind of special creature. We are evolved like all the other animals, but we're a kind of creature, as he says, that can be universal explainers. We can come up with explanations for patterns in the universe that other animals don't seem to be able to do. And it allows us to do quite a bit. And we've re-engineered the world. I mean, the fact that we're trying to contend with this pandemic right now, using our knowledge and the explanation of what causes disease, and then the explanation of what might cure them, or the explanation of just how to mitigate the harm right now of social distancing. No other animal is doing this. Like if coronavirus is ravaging through the lion community, they're not like putting up social distancing, posts on social media. It's a kind of ability that I think a new kind of religion, and we can bring in people like AOC and some of the Green New Deal kind of stuff that just seems to be woven with a lot of this pessimism, is woven with the pessimism that something like a technological fix for something like climate change or coronavirus, although I haven't heard quite that one. People seem to be okay with that. If we have a technological fix, is kind of poo-pooed as like this shortcut that like we as humans didn't change our behavior, right? Like the Greta Thunberg or whatever, who I feel sorry for, by the way, because she's young and I hate like picking on her. But the shame on you kind of attitude really speaks to a kind of religion in progressive circles at the moment, that seems very self-flagellating, to use a religious sort of like view, that people seem to be attracted to, and we could talk about the psychological reasons, but attracted to solutions that involve us being ashamed of what we've done and changing our behavior, because we should be sort of leaving as few footprints in the world as possible and just getting in and out as without making an impact as we can. That view is, again, Deutsch calls it philosophical pessimism, because philosophical optimism would be a view that we can solve that problem. So the way that he views the word crisis, like the climate crisis, or even say the pandemic crisis right now, is like, what is the actual crisis you're talking about when you're talking about the climate? You can answer it by saying, well, the temperature's going up and CO2 is there, so it's 2 degrees hotter. Like, that's not actually a crisis yet. What is the crisis you're talking about? Polar bears are dying, like some bad things are happening. No, the crisis in his view is that the solution to it we don't have the knowledge yet of how to solve it. And so the best that we have of the knowledge of how to solve climate crisis, which if I had some magical machine that could just like clean it all from the air and regulate the temperature as easily as it regulates the air conditioning in this house right now, that would solve the problem, all the problems I just said. But we don't have that knowledge yet. If we didn't, what I just said doesn't break the laws of physics. We just don't know how to do it. And since we don't know how to do it, the best that we have right now to avoid these kinds of crises is changing our behavior in pretty massive ways of like, you know, building differently and maybe not taking that dream vacation you wanted because you're burning fuel in the airplane. What you're actually talking about there, and this is to your point, Vince, about what religion is gets just so wrong, is you're talking about sacrifice. The crisis is actually that humans have to sacrifice. Right now, the fact that we're all doing this on Skype and not hanging out over a beer is a sacrifice. The fact that I can't go outside, the fact that our economy is crashing, there's going to be all kinds of horrors because we just don't want to live in a world where we're pushing all the grandmas onto the tracks. The sacrifice is actually the crisis. If we had the solution, if I had it in my hand right now, that I could press a magic button, all the coronavirus was cured right now, forever, you would want me to press that button. And as soon as I pressed it, we would all go back to our business before this dumb thing made us sacrifice all of these things. And so the religious view of sacrifice is the opposite. It sees sacrifice as the ultimate good. I mean, the story of Abraham is like the dude about to kill his son, and he's going to sacrifice this thing he loves so much to show his devotion to God. Sacrifice is the like top thing you could do in religion. And it is such a pessimistic view philosophically of no, sacrifice is actually terrible. We should be, if we had better knowledge of things, of how to solve the climate crisis and how to solve pandemics, we would be charging ahead in all kinds of other areas and doing what we fucking loved. Like, you should be able to do what you love, and you will inevitably make mistakes because our knowledge is imperfect. And when you make a mistake, or when we make mistakes, we'll have to solve that problem too. And that's the story of the human condition, is running into a problem and then trying to solve it, running into a problem and trying to solve it. But the crisis is the moment of realizing we're going to have to stop learning and progressing and going around the world and all that kind of stuff. Obviously, that was a very simplistic picture of sacrifice, because within sacrifice, you can discover a lot of interesting psychological things. Even in the pandemic, people are discovering some good things. But from a broad view, to put sacrifice and human sacrifice of your behavior at the top of some sort of pyramid of like ultimate moral behavior is just dreadful, and is what you see in a lot of the let's call it progressive religious view, where it seems us sacrificing our behavior and changing our ways is the solution. And even to something like climate change, that's not the solution. The same way in the pandemic of us socially distancing is not curing coronavirus. It's buying time for the people who are trying to come up with scientific solutions to it, to come up with scientific solutions to it. In the climate crisis, traveling less, not buying an SUV, all of that, we're not solving climate change through that. You're not going to hit some perfect zone where we no longer create any pollution. We're just buying a little time until we get the solution. As soon as you get the solution, we're back to charging full steam ahead, which is the story. But there's a religious view of the condition of humanity as rejecting it as godly, right? It's all the stories are saying God is here and humans are here. Where I think atheism, when you get rid of God, there is no God up there. Humans are, let's call us the gods. I mean, we're certainly the ones that have the ability, because we're an interesting kind of animal, at least on this planet, to change the atmosphere, to solve coronavirus, to overcome the naturalistic fallacy. We are not, all we're doing is by trying to solve coronavirus is saying we don't like the way nature is trying to answer the questions for us, which we shouldn't, because nature is constantly just trying to kill us. I didn't like the way nature handled the weather here today in Pennsylvania. So there's a house now over me and it's heating me. Does this make me some sort of, evil, I'm stepping on God's plan? No, it makes me a human that has the ability to change my environment. And moral philosophy, of course, is how the solutions of what you ought to do in that situation. But religious philosophy is just totally void from the start, because it rejects the notion there's no foundation for it other than saying, well, there's a plan somewhere and you just don't know it and you can never know it. So I don't know. I think we're seeing a lot of emptiness in religion at the moment. Makes people feel good, like you said. Some people are still going to church and saying their God will save them or whatever. But I don't know the numbers right now. Most people are hoping for science to answer the question, which feels like a positive step in the in the Yuval Harari sort of narrative scheme.
Yeah,
it sounds like. Go ahead.
I was just gonna say the United States is now officially the only first world country that is predominantly religious. So hopefully we do seem to be headed in that direction.
Yeah.
It sounds like another argument for liberal optimism in the pushback of almost Burkean conservatism, the kind of pessimism inherent in that, because as you say, we have proven ourselves up to the challenge thus far of answering our the obstacle course that Mother Nature has decided to put in front of us, and I guess we'll just have to see what happens this time.
Yeah, and I think I'll also say, I think the outliers in this pandemic of people arguing in really partisan ways or people flaunting the thing, I think generally as a globe, I'm sort of proud of the way the globe has responded. Again, by answering the question, maybe, in a very painful way with crashing the economy, of actually answering the bridge problem with some sort of definitive, whether they answered it correctly or not, with a bit of a definitive answer that's collective. I'm pretty proud of the way that humanity has responded and decided to stay inside and care for each other in some kind of way, whether that is a genuine care or we're all just afraid of social shaming if we go outside. We could talk about the motivations there in that tribal conversation we were having, but I think this is a fairly significant moral moment. If some alien civilization was monitoring us from far away, I feel like they would surely have pity on us for not being able to solve the problem very easily. And I also pointed out in my article, we're very new to this problem. Viruses have only been observed for 120 years. In the grand scheme of humanity, we're very new at trying to solve this problem. But even so, I think that alien civilization might be sort of proud of oh, wow, they're responding very collectively and differently than Spanish flu or these other pandemics that just they had zilch knowledge and zilch cooperation. The knowledge that I wrote about the miasma theory of disease was sort of the best. An alien would certainly pity us if that was what we were operating under. What we're operating under now, they might be like, oh man, I wish I could just give them this little bit of knowledge and they would solve it, but it's better. I mean, it's a step in the right direction.
Well, I know from listening to your podcast with Coleman that you're a Star Trek fan, so now we're probably a long ways away from bending the warp drive. But hopefully, the way we solve this, if we solve this coronavirus problem, however we solve climate change, we just might get the Vulcans to come visit us.
Yeah. I was a big Next Generation fan. I used to watch that with my mom growing up. Maybe you're a bigger fan than I am. I don't know all of the details of it, but. Yeah, it's a great show of sort of the deontologist versus the consequentialist, Kirk versus Spock. I never really knew that growing up, but it's a great kind of moral philosophy show.
I refuse to change my wallet.
I haven't seen Picard yet. No, is it good?
You'll love it.
Yeah. Yeah, it looks great. I mean, that's that episode is fun. That was episode 2 with Eric Linus Kaplan, who's a really, really good writer. Wrote Futurama and all those crazy things. And the Prime Directive, I think, is another one of those really challenging answers, particularly for the religiosity we mentioned on the left, which also takes a very pessimistic view of our abilities when intervening, especially in other cultures. And the ability to intervene with some sort of moral authority. We know the problems that some of the left had with that. And that Star Trek episode in particular, or the Prime Directive one, I think puts a lot of pressure on that, because you'll be hard pressed to find a, let's say, progressive attitude who doesn't like foreign intervention to not want the Federation to go down and stop the volcano and let these people die. And then when you just change it to a genocide or something, it shouldn't really change the picture of it. So yeah, I really like that episode. I think it's right on. Yeah,
I love it as well. It's We probably don't have time to go into it today, so we'll have to bring it back to another podcast.
Yeah, fun.
Like the whole situation with the regressive left and being a liberal myself has done a 180 on my worldviews. I can't look back at Star Trek and and see the prime right and just now just take it for what it is. I'm like, no, especially in light of hearing the story of a mutual friend of ours, Yasmin Mohammed, and like what she had to face with cultural relativism growing up and what the challenges she had to go through, just really puts a spin on how we view the world and cultural aspects coming up through life, and wondering how much of a foundation it really stands on, where do we go in the future.
I'll definitely come back to talk about that. I do want to say, because I don't know the percentage of your audience who there seems to be, at least in the online world, a lot of people who get very, very upset at these problems on the left, and most of them probably like you and I still call ourselves liberal and grew up on the left and all that. And I don't even know where to like put this thought, but I'm dismayed by seeing a lot of them get angrier and angrier at this problem to a point where they can overcorrect, and it distorts them into some let's call it religious, a religious kind of view of hatred of that, where you're no longer actually thinking for yourself or critically thinking or applying sort of scientific thought to problems. You're just seeing the lefty boogeyman behind every corner. I know it's very frustrating. I know it's infuriating. I made the film Islam and the Future of Tolerance a lot out of that frustration. I went to a very liberal school where I was in a post 9/11 world, very horrified by the state of the conversation about liberalism and why it wasn't good enough for other countries but good enough for me. And I found the arguments ripe with this sort of cultural relativism, and it's very frustrating. If anyone's listening out there and feels that, I feel your frustration, but like, don't let it eat you up to the point of like a Dave Rubin or Candace Owens or these kind of people who just lose their damn mind. And then there's also the temptation of garnering an audience there where, because, and this might even wrap it up, you end up with Donald Trump as your president, as someone who loves, they love drinking liberal tears, and Trump drives people crazy, and they share memes of liberals going nuts over Donald Trump and all this stuff. But which is all fun and games until there's a fucking pandemic, because then Carl Schmitt's king switch flips, and we need someone to take charge. It's that we actually just need it in a moment of crisis for someone to take charge. I actually just did, this is a plug, I'll probably put it out tomorrow. I did another Emergency Dilemma episode with Amanda Ripley. She's an amazing journalist and writer, and she wrote a book called The Unthinkable, Who Survives Disaster and Why. She wrote it 12 years ago. It's an incredible book. It's about plane crashes and 9/11 and stampedes at the Hajj and all kinds of incredibly interesting things. But we talked, of course, about the pandemic and as a disaster. And we talked the psychology of what happens in a disaster, a very quick disaster like an earthquake, or a 9/11 type situation, or a very slow moving disaster like this one, are very similar. And the notion of authority, because we are animals who get scared, is very, very strong in those moments. So George W. Bush having a 91% approval rating on September 12th is that kind of king switch. Donald Trump's is not there, of course, as you know, but I think there's a good reason why it's not there. It's gone up a little, but this is not the king switch for Donald Trump. And I think with the kinds of threats that we face, of pandemics and AI and global terrorism and all these new kinds of threats that are global threats, there's going to be it's a delicate balance, but it matters who's in the throne when you flip the king switch. And having it be Donald Trump, I know you thought it was funny to piss off all the liberals by, having him in there and making jokes and spreading memes and being a troll and president. And yes, the left deserved a swift slap in the face for their behavior, but it actually matters. And I just don't think it's funny anymore. So if anybody's listening out there, and just check yourself if you're not just still mad at liberals, of why you're having a good time with Donald Trump. And I'm not even like going to talk about Joe Biden or whatever the liberals are putting out there. Just see if you're actually still critically thinking. And in a vacuum, would you have chosen Donald Trump, or was it a reaction to sort of the left and its flaws. It's we're in a dangerous spot with that. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I love Andrew Yang, and yeah, and if you think the pandemic is a global threat, obviously automation being a threat to the human labor market is a monumental threat that Andrew's been talking about, and I've been concerned about for quite some time. Our economics are all, if there's one good thing, here's another. I mean, there's a lot of good things that could come out of this pandemic if we retain some of them in these lessons. One of them, the stimulus bill, we could argue about all day, but there is, I think for the first time ever, at least in the US, an unemployment benefit in there for gig workers and freelancers, which I am one of. I think that's the first time that's happened in this country. Correct me if I'm wrong, listeners. I think if that's a shift in the notion that gig economy workers are a huge percentage of this country and growing more and more, and almost all of their jobs, especially the Uber drivers, are under direct threat from automation. Maybe there's, I mean, the fact that Andrew Yang's on the phone now with the White House, it's just such a bizarre turn of events the way this is all happened right after he dropped out. But there are important conversations and threads to pick up when the dust settles from this, which might be years, who knows, that we should retain. I think that's one of the most important ones that's sort of going under the radar right now. That would be very much an Andrew Yang point of just noticing that, hey, the economy built on healthcare being provided by your employer, of a full-time employer, is a ridiculous idea to begin with, and then have, you know, the entire structure just being old and outdated and totally head in the sand about the coming wave of automation is something that might appear of picking up the pieces of whatever we try to do with this economy. So yeah, I'm a huge Andrew Yang fan, but one thing that is a little depressing about it is, like with the pandemic, everybody knew it was coming. Like literally everybody knew it was coming, with the graphs in Italy and Spain going up, and everyone's just telling the US like, hey, you're 9 days behind Italy. Are you going to do anything? Like, and still nobody does anything until they're like, oh shit, like it's here. So Andrew Yang can be eloquent and show all the graphs he wants about automation. I'm at the moment a bit pessimistic that people will only respond the moment that, you know, the robot kicks them out of their driver's seat, and then they're like, oh shit, automation's here. It's like, yeah, we told you. So we're a very reactive species, unfortunately. So we might have to go through pain there. I don't know. But I'm glad Andrew, I'm really proud of his campaign and how he got the conversation as far as he got, honestly. I actually filmed a little thing with him when he came to New York when he was just starting out. And I filmed like an interview he did with 13 of us in a room. And at the time I'm like, this is amazing. Like, if he even gets to one debate, I'll be thrilled. And then he got really far and made some noise. I'm actually incredibly proud of what he's done. Did better than I thought he would do. And yeah, he's out there. He's known. So there was some rumors that he would run for mayor of New York, which might be open soon because Bill de Blasio is falling on his face hard right now. So it'd be interesting to see what Andrew does for sure.
Yeah, that's the good thing, right? I was always concerned. I mean, as much as I supported Andrew Yang, I was a huge math bumper sticker on my car. I'm a staunch supporter of Andrew Yang. I never expected him to get close to the presidency, but he certainly got closer than I ever expected him to get. And as you said, at the very least, he got UBI the attention it deserves. So I'm happy about that. And it's times like these that, as you've mentioned, of course, we need to focus on reaching across the aisle and ensuring that we're having genuine, productive conversations with people on the opposite side of the road. And it doesn't help that people who complain a lot about the regressive left, like Ben Shapiro, yeah, the regressive left, they're not willing to have conversations, but it also doesn't help that you're selling mugs that say liberal tears on it. That's why I very much like Jonah Goldberg's stance on it. He's like Jonah Goldberg, who's also a conservative commentator. He says, like, look, I'm friends with Ben Shapiro, but I don't like what he's doing with these whole liberal tears mugs, or the way that he doesn't say anything about the fact that there are a bunch of teenagers uploading videos that are titled "Ben Shapiro destroys liberals." It doesn't help. It really doesn't help. But yeah, I think
there's money to be made there. I think Sam Harris very eloquently, as he often is, and he's a very, very nice guy, probably, much nicer than any, if any of us. But with Dave Rubin, he said he's experiencing the phenomenon of being captured by one's audience, which to me is like a very polite way of saying he's a cheap sellout. But there's money to be made when you certainly get, and it's also just confirmation. And again, I've spoken a lot about Dave, so I won't do it here. But I said that last spiel about maybe your viewers who maybe find these conversations because maybe it's not cool for them they're not able to have them in public because it's not safe because of sort of the regressive left's stances and all that. I feel for that frustration. I feel for that anger. There is an audience there of people who are also, we just know anger sells. It's almost like the old mantra in the 80s of sex sells when you're doing advertising. In the age of social media, it's like outrage and anger sells. But hopefully it's boring. It just doesn't seem to be for people. They keep selling those mugs, I'm guessing. But I hope it's just not. I hope it's not funny anymore, and I also hope the left learns its lessons, which also is the other part of, I don't know. I don't think anybody's very thrilled with the way that conversation's going either. So, there's a lot of hard work to do. I don't know if there's an opportunity in this pandemic to come together with any of it. I don't know. I'm a little dismayed that Joe Biden is the best that they could put out there, to be honest.
Well, I guess that's a good place to end the podcast on.
Yeah, but vote for him.
Yeah, vote. I have good news, however. This is officially the longest podcast we've ever had.
Oh, good. I'm glad I set the record. Yes.
Yeah, it used to be Armin Navabi. Armin, I'm sorry, but yours was an hour and 43 minutes. We're hitting up on an hour and 50 minutes on this one, so this is officially the longest podcast we've ever had.
I've had some long arguments with Armin too, so I could say like I won this one too, by 3 minutes.
Yeah, bringing up Islamic reform with him is going to cause a whole 6-hour podcast that will never end with him.
Yeah, and the funny thing was with Armin is I actually like agree with him fundamentally, but I'm just like not as staunch as he is. I'm just a little more like, I don't know, man. Like I don't know the answer. It's much more personal for him, obviously. So
if Armin is Christopher Hitchens, you're Sam Harris, I think.
I'll take the compliment, I guess. Yeah.
All right. Well, Jay, thanks for joining us on the podcast. It's been an absolute honor to have you on.
It's been really fun. Yeah, anytime, guys. It was really fun.
All right. Well, everyone, thanks for coming on.
Cool.
Thanks for listening to this episode. Be sure to follow Jay Shapiro on Twitter. He's a genuinely great guy. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel, The Babylon Project, and be sure to follow me at Latent Physicist on Twitter if you're interested. As always, hope to see you in the next one.